So let me just start just saying it's an absolute privilege to have you and to talk to you. I mean, you are probably the greatest climber of all time. You're an elite athlete that I can only imagine what you've done. I mean, I saw the movie Free Solo. It was inspiring when I saw it. I never thought I'd be speaking to you. It's absolutely terrifying to watch, even online, just getting the pictures and seeing those trees below you, at that distance is scary for the average person. It's an Oscar-winning movie, so it's just amazing what you've done. But most importantly, I'm excited to learn from you. I mean, the context of this is I've set from a vitality standpoint, a goal of achieving a 5-minute mile. I'm really working hard to get there. I've torn a calf muscle, which I felt was risky till I heard about your story, but be that as it may, I mean, the whole idea is narrative about setting goals, physical activity, which is critical, but the idea that setting goals creates hope and agency, and changes people's lives. And, I think there are few people who set a goal of your scale and achieved it. I mean, I think there'll be less people doing what you've done and walk on the moon. So it's remarkable. I thought just maybe starting out with just goal setting generally. I mean, in sport, goals are defined, win a specific tournament, the rules are written. In business, you've got context of laws and how markets work. So, but in climbing mountains, there is no necessarily goal setting mindset. How do you think about goal setting, and how did you think about setting a goal of that scale?
Yeah, goal setting in climbing is interesting. I mean, so there are a few obvious goals, which is just to climb the next harder grade. So when you start climbing, and I started climbing at a climbing gym, there's sort of a pyramid of grades where you're like, oh, I've done a V6, now it's a V7, now a V8. So it's pretty straightforward in that sense. There's a clear path to improvement, much like in running, if you're just trying to run a slightly faster time. And then, as a kid, I did some of the youth competitions, traveled around my home state and did, youth comps. And so then it's kind of, it's obvious how to improve. But once you sort of age out of the youth competitions, then, especially, and this was 20 years ago, and climbing was much smaller of a sport, then it was kind of up to me, up to the individual to choose what they're interested in and what they think is possible and what's what can be done. And I think that's the really interesting part of goal setting is when you survey the landscape and sort of choose, what hasn't been done before, but I think I can do, and I don't know, that's kind of the secret challenge of being a professional climber, is figuring out what's possible that hasn't been done before, but it's still meaningful.
So it's quite a creative process. I mean, it's so this 3,000-foot El Capitan. I mean, I've actually been to Yosemite many years ago. I think I saw it. It's bizarre to think of someone climbing up this thing. What makes it so special? And how did you get that inspiration to do it? Is it unique? And
it's important to remember that the free soloing El Cap is in this greater context of me as a climber. And so I've done something like 35 or so free solos that haven't been done before, like big walls like that around the whole world, but mostly around the Western US and Canada, and really all over the world. But so, I've done something like 35 things like that. El Cap is kind of the culmination of this very long path. And each one of the things that I've done that were sort of similar, they're each difficult in the right way or similar scale in some ways. Some of them are not as big but quite hard. Some of them are really, really big but not quite as hard. It's like when you kind of cherry pick the pieces of all of these different things that I've done, they kind of add up to a similar experience to El Cap. El Cap is probably still the most challenging and difficult thing I've done, and that's why there was a documentary film crew following the whole 2-year journey. It's like, that's why it became a successful film. It is definitely a different scale, but all the pieces could have been found in the other things that I've been doing for the previous 10 or 15 years.
So it's interesting. It's still a stretch. I mean, as you say, you've done it in different ways, but to actually set about that as a goal is a massive stretch. I mean, there's a massive, what if I can do it? There's a big potential. You can't do it. What did you think?
Yeah, well, for me, I think that's the beauty of a good goal, is something that's a stretch but still seems possible, where the elements of it are there. You're like, oh, I can imagine doing it. Like it should be possible. but it's pretty scary. Like it seems like a lot to actually do it. And I think that's been the case for me with, say these 35 other things that I've free soloed along the way. Each one of those represents a small step. I mean, in climbing, I talk about broadening your comfort zone. Like, you can't do these kinds of things if they're really scary for you. And the only way to make them less scary is to sort of systematically broaden yourself to the point that you feel comfortable doing it. And I think with goal setting, it's basically the same process. It's like if you set your goal too far ahead, then it seems impossible. And it's not that motivating to work on it. And if the goal is too easy, then it's also not that motivating. But when it's right on the edge, then it's kind of tantalizingly close. You're like, oh, I mean, I think I could do that, but it's going to be really hard. I mean, that's the best kind of goal.
Yeah, no, that's incredibly wise. I mean, that's some of the narrative we've had about if it's too close, it's a target. If it's too far, you won't get there. So there's some, but listen, what you did is of a goal of, I want to turn to the risk issue, obviously, and give you some latitude because, most goals, as I said, my goal, I've hurt my calf. It's not exactly, there's no risk in that, so to speak. But I mean, just the issue. And when we spoke briefly, I was intrigued by the concept. When I watched the movie, when you start out on the bottom, just that mad step of I'm going to walk up this thing. That start is it's of such gravitas, just to get going. But I'm always worried about when I watch this movie, most goals you can stop, you can't do it. In your case, half up the wall, you're getting into difficulty. You can't go back, but you had said to me, you can sit there and wait. I've watched the movie again since we spoke. I just can't imagine being halfway up there and being in difficulties. How do you think about risk? Most people think it's kind of madness. How do you process risk?
Well, I mean, I think I process risk the same as anybody else. I mean, basically try to minimize risk as much as possible. I mean, I think the important starting point is that I don't want to die doing this any more than anybody else does. The challenge is to do it in a way that feels safe, that feels controlled enough. It's like, obviously there's always going to be some risk in rock climbing, but it's not, the idea is to make it a lot less risky than people think it is when they see it. It's like when you watch it on film, you're like, that's insane. But when you've spent 25 years climbing full time, practicing nonstop, 2 years specifically practicing this one specific route and memorizing the sequences and, deciding how you feel on it, it's a lot less risky. I mean, the whole point of all the training preparation is to make it feel as comfortable as possible.
So when you on 3,000 feet, excuse my ignorance, every step is maybe half a foot. You know what I mean? So you're taking, say, 6,000 actions. I mean, it was all perfect. Did any go wrong? Were there any points in that climb that you were like, I didn't prepare for this. This is problematic. But it just plays through.
Yeah, actually, so as a climber, you describe it sort of as moves, and it's actually probably more than 6,000 moves because the foot movements are just as important as the hand movements. And so, there's a lot of precise moving of parts. But yeah, basically it all went according to plan. I mean, there were a few parts where I felt more nervous than others. I mean, the thing about it is no matter how much you prepared and how excited you are to do this thing that you've been working on, it still has never been done before and you've never done it before. So no matter how confident you feel, there's always a little bit of hesitation or a little bit of, anxiety, excitement, whatever you want to call it, around doing something totally new. And I mean, I found that with all the things that I've free soloed is that no matter how confident you are that you can do something, if it's never been done before, there's still a little bit of like, oh, well, what if there's something that I don't know about it? Like, what if there's something I didn't anticipate? I mean, there's always a little bit of self-doubt. I mean, but the whole point of preparation is to minimize that as much as possible.
Yeah, no, I mean that's a lesson for anyone listening is preparation. As tough as these goals are, it just seems the level of professionalism and commitment and preparation is so fundamental. When you got to the top, I think in the movie you say there's a feeling of perfection. I feel kind of perfect. What did it? Whenever you achieve a goal, I think not a goal of your scale, but there is that feeling. How did that feel?
I felt, yeah, super good. I mean, I'm sure you can imagine. I mean, it's still probably the best climbing experience in my life. And part of that is because I was so well prepared for it. I'd worked so hard on it for so long. Like I probably could have done the actual climb sooner. It just wouldn't have felt so good. I could have probably gotten away with it sooner. but it would have been sort of squeaking by. But instead, when I did it, it actually felt great. It felt, yeah, like smooth and comfortable, and everything went well. So, I mean, it was sort of an interesting lesson in that it was worth putting all that extra effort into it, because then, I had sort of this peak experience instead of this, because I've definitely had a lot of other free solos where I felt like I barely got away with something, or, like I did it, but it didn't feel great. You're like, those are satisfying in their own way, but it's not really what I'm aspiring to.
That's remarkable. Tell me
I
something.
mean, I'm sure for you it'd be the same if you managed to run your 5-minute mile, but you freaking have a stroke when you cross the finish line. You'd be like, well, I did my goal, but it's not quite what I hoped for. You know what I mean? It's like, I'm sure you're aspiring to run across looking smooth and graceful, and then feeling good, and then taking a little extra lap around the track, feeling like a champion. But if you cross the finish line and like you're completely seized in every muscle, and then you can't run again for months, you're kind of like, well, I did my goal, but I'm not really proud of it in the way that I'd like to be.
But there is something, I think, no matter what your goal is, achieving it, if it's a stretch, gives you a sense of, even if it's a basic goal, but it's a stretch for an individual, it's transformational. Let me ask you something. I mean, there's, given what you've done, and the kind of, to the layperson, the fear of it, there's been a lot written about how you process fear, that your brain kind of works differently. Your amygdala fires differently.
No,
Is that, what do you think of that?
No, I think that's actually a slight misunderstanding. I think that in the film Free Solo, there's like a tiny little scene where they show me getting an fMRI, and there are a couple little lines about the brain, but it's too short of a scene. I mean, it's a 90-minute documentary. It's hard to sum up 2 years of training, preparation in life, leading up to this climb. And so that whole scene with the brain thing is too short to do it justice. They were there filming this journalist who was doing this long form article about risk taking fMRI, and sort of like high sensation seeking individuals who normally are gamblers and addicts and things like that, but basically people who are very comfortable with risk. And that's in Nautilus magazine, or it won this like science journalism award thing. And if you look up that article and read it, it's a much more nuanced look at the whole thing, which basically questions, it's a sort of chicken and the egg, like which came first? Am I by nature desensitized to risk, or because I've been taking risks systematically for 10 or 15 years, have I desensitized myself to them? And so, to me, it seemed clear that it was the latter, that, through systematic practice, I have desensitized myself to something, just because I know that when I was younger, it was quite scary. Things that were very scary when I was younger now feel totally mundane. And that's because I've been doing them nonstop for 10 or 15 years. I mean, when I think of the first walls that I free soloed, the first time I ever climbed, a 300-foot wall without a rope, something near my home in Sacramento. I mean, the first time I was like, this is so extreme. It's like if I slip, I die. And it's like, now I would climb those routes in my tennis shoes, like in, casual non-climbing shoes. It'd be like a super easy outing and be very relaxed, because I've done thousands and thousands of things like that at this point. And so, to me, it's not that there's anything different with my amygdala. It's just that, if you practice something nonstop for years, it just becomes normal.
That is fascinating. I mean, I accept that. I find it kind of, not demeaning, but patronizing to write off these things as you don't process risk in anything that requires that amount of skill. People don't appreciate when you have that skill. There isn't the fear. As you say, you've done it so many times. It is fascinating. But let me ask you this: some anecdotes of scariest climbs. Are there times when you've got into real potential difficulty? Any really great experiences you've had that tell you, geez, things can happen, or there are scary times?
Yeah, there's so many scary times. I mean, and that's kind of the thing, is that, when people say that, like, oh, your amygdala just doesn't fire, I'm like, no, I think my amygdala is just tired, because it's so scared all the time for so many years. It's just gotten desensitized to that kind of thing. Actually, I mean, and that was the thing with the experiment with the fMRI, is that they put you into, an functional MRI. Yeah, basically you're in a metal tube, and then they show you pictures, and it's supposed to light up the fear response in your brain, but you're completely safe. You're inside a lab, laying inside this tube. And so, I was like, why would this be scary? Like, why would this trigger a fear response? It's like you're just looking at black and white photos. But so, I mean, generally, in like the control group, seeing these black and white images does still trigger the same response in your brain. But the rational part of you is like, like, why would that trigger a fear response? Doesn't even make any sense. I was like, oh, if I threw a snake into the fMRI, like that would trigger my fear response, because like I don't want to get bitten by a snake, but like looking at pictures is never gonna set off my fear,
Yeah.
And that's because I spent so much time actually being afraid, where you're like, oh no, it's I mean, I don't even know what the best anecdote to start with is. I mean, literally day in and day out. I think that's actually the better way to describe, how much I've been afraid, is to think that, I'm out climbing, say 5 or 6 days a week. I go on sort of adventures like, rest day scrambles, or like things, where you go try to like find something new. Like I just did this big traverse of this mountain range near my house. It was a 32-hour continuous. I did all these classic routes. I summited something like 20 mountains, but so it's the 32 hours of continuous climbing. It's taken me sort of on and off over the last year or two to figure out the way through all these mountains, because a lot of it was sort of new terrain, and it was a creative process to figure out how to connect all these classic climbs. And so I probably did 60 or 80 days of sort of prep for it as I pieced together the segments. And on probably a third or maybe half of those days, something would go slightly sideways, where, I would try to descend into some canyon that I've never been into before. Like one of the days I wound up going down this, as it turns out, it was a canyoneering route, like a slot canyon where people do like 20 rappels into pools of water and stuff like that. And I just had a little day bag with no more food and water. I'd already gone up and over one mountain. So I was like, basically, I was just trying to get back to my car. And then I wound up descending into the slot canyon, which I didn't know existed because it's like a very obscure part of this park. And I was suddenly like, oh my God, I'm like down climbing a slot canyon. They're like pools of water, there were rappels all over it. I was like, I don't have a rope, I don't have any equipment. I was like, this is all pretty mega. And wound up basically staggering out the bottom, totally haggard, being like, what happened? I didn't. And that's just like a normal day, that's just trying to figure out the way from one peak to the next. I was like trying to find the easiest way. In that particular case, I found the absolute hardest way by accident. But, when you think that I'm having experiences like that, like a couple days a week, year round for years and years, it's like, there's so much sort of micro fear, where like every couple days you're like, I think I'm lost, or like I'm in the woods by myself, I'm slightly lost, I'm not totally sure the best way to get home. It's like, that's so routine. I think that's the aspect of climbing, particularly the stuff that I'm doing, that's sort of underappreciated. When people are like, oh, were you scared? And you're like, yeah, I mean, you're dealing with uncertainty all the time.
But you must have, I mean, I'm always intrigued what it takes to make a good climber. And this is something you can't do later in life. I mean, listening to your kind of experience, this is stuff that your brain has processed since you were a small child. I mean, you've got, what makes a good climber? Is it athletic capability, or is it coordination? I mean, what attributes give you the ability to do this?
Actually, I think more than most sports, climbing has a broad array of possibility. Like, I think you can be physically gifted, you could be mentally gifted, you could not be gifted at all and just work really hard. I think more than most other sports, climbing, because climbing, is obviously very physical, like you need your body, but it's also very technical. Like how you use your body is very important. And so if you're really smart about your technique and how you climb, you can get away with being quite a bit weaker. So like I'm a good example of that. Actually, I'm quite a bit weaker. Like I'm much less strong than many of my peers who are professional climbers. But I'm experienced, I'm pretty technical. And part of that's a trade-off, just because I spend so much time doing these big adventures and like scrambling in the mountains, that it's kind of like if you spend all your time ultra running, it's really hard to run an elite mile. It's like if you're out running 50 miles all the time, it's really hard to run 1 mile super fast. And so part of that is my problem. I'm not doing these big adventures nonstop, and so I'm just not that strong. But then you can kind of get away with it by being very skilled technically, having good strategy, things like that. But actually, so I mean, climbing is pretty low impact on your body, and so you can do it much later in life than most other sports, because it doesn't, like, you rarely have injuries, and because it's so technical, it's like skill based, kind of like skiing or something, where you could ski your entire life and have a great time doing it.
Yeah. Is it? I was intrigued. I mean, we spoke the amount of exertion to get up that wall. I mean, it's, again, simplifying it, it's 6,000 pull-ups. Maybe I'm being a bit extravagant, but how?
No, but that's where technique really comes in, because if you have really good technique, it's not doing 6,000 pull-ups. It's like doing 6,000 steps on a stair stepper, which is pretty reasonable. It's like 6,000 steps. You're like, oh, that's a normal day. So depending on how good you are at keeping your weight transferred over your feet, keeping your center of mass over your footholds, using your feet well, that's all the technique that you learn in climbing, and that makes it less physical if you can be, a good technical climber.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Tell me something. Most people, I just want to talk about risk and longevity. I think most people go through life, longevity above all, avoiding any risk in the pursuit of a long life without maybe meaning. Whereas I think you're living a very meaningful life, but there's some risk. I mean, that trade-off, is this something you've made explicitly, or just, I mean, it's clearly you're living a life of considerable impact and meaning, but there's a risk, longevity versus meaning. How do you see it?
Well, I mean, one way that I see it is that no matter what, life isn't going to feel long enough. It's like whether you live to old age or you die young, either way, in the grand scheme of things, it's a tiny, you're a tiny piece of dust in the cosmos. I mean, like living to 40 versus living to 60, what's or to 80 or 90, it's like, what's another 10 years in the grand scheme of the world? It's like in human history, or even the history of the world, you're like, who cares? Basically whenever you die, it's going to feel too soon. Like if you die at 80, you're going to wish you made it to 90 because, you want to see your grandkids graduate college or whatever else. Like there's always some other milestone that you're sort of waiting for, hoping for. You're like, oh, I want to see my youngest grandkid get married. It's like everybody wants to live a little longer, and so I guess my thought is that no matter what, you want more of it. But like, what's the point in living a really long time if it's not full of things that you care about?
No, that's profound. It is profound. Has your mindset changed? I mean, when the movie was made, I think you were just dating your wife now. You weren't a father. I mean, my own experience when I became a father, I suddenly had this, and maybe for the dynamics you're mentioning, I suddenly had this need to stay alive. I'm like, I want to see there's something like chemistry that changed in my brain, certainly. Has that happened to you at all? I mean, you've now got a daughter. Does it change your perception of risk, or do you feel the same?
So far, I don't think it's totally changed my perception of risk, but it definitely has changed the way I spend my time a little bit. Obviously I want to spend more time at home, more time with my daughter. And so I think that just by changing my sort of time use, it'll probably change the risks that I take a little bit. I mean, if nothing else, just I'm less likely to go out for rest day scrambles and things like that, where, in the past, rest days meant you're just bed resting in your van. And so you'd kind of get bored by afternoon and be like, oh, I'll go out and scramble some little route to like check out some new thing. I just have less time like that. So, I mean, overall, I'm probably taking less risk just because I'm not going on those little extra adventures and things like that. But I mean, that's not to say that my appetite for risk has changed too much, but it's more just that, time and like the way I spend my time is changing, obviously, as a father.
Let me ask a few other just that always intrigued me. I always was intrigued by the first ascent of Everest, Hillary and Tenzing Norgay. I mean, he got to this Hillary step and there were no ropes and ladders. So I think he kind of free solo basically at 40 or 50. I don't know how far it was, but is that I mean, it's at 8,000 or 9,000 meters. I mean, it's mad. Is that an impressive climb and in your sense of climbing up a rock face, or is it kind of basic?
Yeah, it's not technically challenging. I mean, it's not, I mean, I have friends who have done that and I recreated what he did in the old equipment to sort of see, if it was possible and how and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it's not cutting edge climbing by any means, but certainly at that time, at that moment, it's cutting edge, in those conditions at high altitude, having never been done before, feeling hypoxic, like an addled mind, from no oxygen. It's like, no, it's super impressive. It's a super impressive feat of human effort. But by modern standards of technical climbing, no, I mean, that's not cutting edge rock climbing, but it's certainly a cutting edge experience. I mean, I mean, there's a reason that the highest mountain on earth hadn't been climbed before, because it's really difficult. And so, for them to overcome those difficulties is super impressive for sure. But, by a modern standard, that's not like cutting edge alpinism or anything.
So are there, I mean, are there other, there must be obviously not infinite, but huge number of mountains. What is something that's unclimbed of scale today that you think about? Are there must be many, like,
Oh
oh,
yeah, there's so much. I mean, there's giant walls all over the world. And actually just this summer, I got to climb this 4,000 foot wall sticking out of the fjord in Greenland. So basically 4,000 feet, so like bigger than El Cap, just coming straight out of the ocean. That was part of this project with National Geographic. We went and did this little TV show in Greenland. So we climbed a couple new walls, one of which was truly gigantic in scale. And unfortunately, it was really poor rock quality. But that's the kind of thing about doing first ascents is you never really know until you get there and climb it. So in this case, it's probably not destined to be classic because it was quite loose and dangerous and not great climbing, but still, I mean, it's one of the biggest walls in the world, so it's still pretty cool. But no, I mean, there are walls in Pakistan and Baffin Island and like, I mean, India, Nepal, like the Karakoram, the Himalaya, like, I mean, they're basically big walls all over the world that I'm interested in. It's just a question of, especially now having a family, it's just harder to take 6 weeks away to go on an expedition. So it means that whatever objective you choose has to really be worth it to spend that much time away from family.
So listen, it really has been a real honor, really a real honor speaking to you. I mean, I just my last question is lessons about goal setting and lessons about achieving them. There are few people that have set a goal as audacious and as just for the average person unreal to achieve. I mean, in setting goals, what are your thoughts?
Well, but I think the important thing is to set a goal that's not too audacious, and I know that from your perspective, El Cap, must seem insane. But the thing is, when I got to that point, it was sort of like next on a list, like I had done a lot of things leading up to it. And it was definitely bigger and harder, but it wasn't actually that much bigger or harder than things that I'd previously saw leading up to it. So when I said, I mean, yeah, it's an audacious goal, but it wasn't on, it was like within the realm of possibility. Like for, I don't know, for maybe 4 years or so in my climbing journals, I've always had lists of like to-do lists and goal lists and things like that kind of floating. Like I normally have my climbing journal where I keep track of everything I climb, and it's very, very clinical. It's just like, this is what I climb, this is the difficulty, this is the time, things like that. And then I've always had sort of a training journal where I keep like training notes and just general, sometimes notes on nutrition or load, like the volume of effort that I'm doing, sort of like the less obviously quantifiable things. But the things that are still really useful to know in terms of improving as a climber. So it's like, the general exercise you do during the day, keeping track of jogs and things like that, rather than just pure climbs. So in my training journal, in the back, I'd always have lists of goals, I'd occasionally draw out information for routes and things. Like if I failed on something and wasn't going to be coming back till next season, I would draw it all out so I could remember it. So when I come back, it'd be easier to finish what I'd started. And so the goal lists, you'd always have sort of to-do lists of like, okay, here are little climbs that I'm working on. But if you don't do them, it doesn't totally matter. It's like you just come back and do them another time. And then the bigger goals. And so I had a list of maybe, I think it was 4 different routes that were like big challenging walls that had never been free soloed, and I had them all in the back of my journal just as initials because it felt too much to write out the whole like, I want to free solo this route. And in case anybody ever sees it, you're sort of like, well, it's slightly embarrassing to have goals that big to some extent because it just felt like too. So for maybe 4 or 5 years, I just had these little initials in the back of the journals, like these are things that I want to do. And over the course of those 4 years, I did the 3 other ones that were leading up to El Cap. And so it was just a little EC in the bottom of the list for years. And, it's like by the time I finally got to that, like it made sense within its own context. I had done the other 3 things on the list, which, I mean, doesn't totally matter. I mean, they're sort of obscure routes in a way, but they each are similar in scale and difficulty. And they each had elements of difficulty that were very similar to El Cap. Like one was very technical on granite, one was very physical on granite, and then one was bigger and more difficult on limestone. And they each sort of incorporate elements of what you find in El Cap. And so I had done those 3 things, and you're kind of left with the last one on the list. So in that context, it's not quite as audacious of a goal. You know what I mean? I mean, it's still a big goal, but you're like, well, I've finished the list. It's the last one. You got to get to it. You know.
It's fascinating. You know, I chatted to Sebastian Coe, who's one of the greatest milers of all time. I mean, it's a completely different endeavor, but the preparation and the preparing for every eventuality and just listening to you, the inspiration is the goal to us looks, audacious to the power of 10, but to you, it's a stretch, but it's doable. But the preparation and the meticulous drive and commitment is what makes it doable. It's not a risky endeavor, where you're betting the house. It feels unbelievably planned and cerebral. It's
Yeah, I
really
mean, to me, it felt like the end of a very long road. Like I've been on a road for a long, long time, and it's like this is the next stop. There's a certain inevitability to it almost. I'm like, oh, I've been working my way toward this in a roundabout way. Doing things that are similar to it and getting closer and closer for literally 10 years. It's like at a certain point you have to just do the thing that you've been thinking about for so long.
Yeah. It's a great way to end. Great way to end. Listen, what an inspiring
I kind of want to hear how you're how's the 500 mile besides the torn calf or the injured calf.
Well,
how's your goal going?
It was going okay, but I think I violated every principle. I have zero talent. The goal is too much of a stretch, So the attributes of my goal are nothing close to what you've done, but I'm learning along the way. Just and the narrative on our discussions on this topic of people with terminal illness, and it's amazing how goals and agency gives people hope. So just listening to what you've done it's fascinating. It's great fan and an absolute honor and pleasure to speak to you.
No, I appreciate that. But so are you giving up on a 500 mile?
No, I've had every treatment known, platelet injections it's a torn calf, and it comes from at 58 trying to escalate mileage quickly, and
too quickly.
intensely. And but I tell you, I touched heaven for a moment. I just, in the training, suddenly, you know what I mean? I mean, I'm a casual runner. Suddenly I'm running at like, I don't know, 320 a K, per kilometer, feeling really good. It's, so not quite the pace I need to be at, but the improvement. I mean, the lesson is getting proper help, at your point, preparing properly. The improvement is dramatic, but no, I'm not giving up at all.
Are you still doing cardio stuff with the calf? I mean, because you could be riding using the elliptical, like using a bicycle.
Yeah.
Basically keep the engine strong, even if you can't be running that fast.
I'm doing exactly that. So I can't stop. I'm a kind of driven guy. I went for a run. I can't stop going fast, which hurts the calf, So I'm now cycling, just trying to keep exactly that, keeping my cardio in place, etc. So I'm a worker, I'm going to apply myself, but it is fascinating.
One of a random anecdote. My now wife used to live in a house with a bunch of women in Seattle, and one of them was sort of an Olympic hopeful runner. Like an elite runner who was like trying for the Olympic team, never quite made it, but had she injured a foot or a leg or something and wound up getting really into the elliptical as just a way to sort of rehab. But when an Olympic aspirant goes hard on the elliptical, like she was really going hard on the elliptical. And it turns out there's something called the elliptigo, which is like a bicycle. It's like an elliptical that moves, like a bicycle version of an elliptigo. And she wound up winning the elliptigo world championships because it's a pretty neat, like not that many people using the elliptical at that level. I was sort of like, oh, that's what you get into when you're injured, is just hit that elliptical as hard as it goes.
That's drive. I'm gonna be doing that, I assure you. But that's good advice. Good advice. Listen, appreciate it. So this mountain you climbed off out of the sea, is that filmed? Will that be?
Yeah, that'll be a show on National Geographic. I think next spring. They're still working on it. It's 3 episodes. We climbed another wall along the way, and we traversed this ice cap, and we did a bunch of climate science. We were with this French glaciologist. It was a really cool trip. It was a big adventure. It was 6 weeks across eastern Greenland, sort of investigating this new area and then climbing this gigantic wall. It was pretty cool.
And is the sea below you?
Yeah, it's the fjord, so it's the ocean, but it's kind of the big tongues of ocean coming into the glaciers.
That's the thought of it.
Yeah, it was cool. Every day when we were climbing, you see these giant glaciers just floating out to sea below you. or giant icebergs, it's like giant like pieces of the glacier capping off and floating away, and you're just like climbing all day watching the icebergs float by. That's crazy.
What a life. What a life. Listen, thank you for doing this. Greatly appreciate
Oh, my pleasure.
it. Look forward to seeing that show. I found your free solo just inspiring, just amazing.
No, I appreciate it, and good luck with the 5-minute mile.
Thank you.
Yeah, I hope you heal up well.
Yeah, thank you.